Welcome back. Thank you for staying with Bottom Line Africa. We now want to have a discussion centered on Africa Week in Review, just highlighting some of the notable developments that have happened across the week in the continent. Now, joining me in studio to help us delve deeper into some of the substantial developments is John Gashie. Not his first time here, so definitely looking forward to having this discussion. John, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. Now, I think the focus in South Africa has been quite imminent and quite unfortunate turn of events right there. But even as we talk about the spate of attacks and protests that hit Johannesburg and other areas as well, let's just try and look at the underlying issue. What exactly might have caused a precipitation of such violence in Africa, meted towards fellow Africans? I mean, it's quite unfortunate, don't you think?
Yeah, well, on the face of it, it's quite, indeed, very unfortunate, and it's very sad that, that Africans would really be at the receiving end of this unfortunate incidents and violence. But I would want to point out that possibly the issue is not so much that it's against Africans per se. It's perhaps an indication of a failure of the South African socio-political economic structures to address residual issues of apartheid and the issues of exclusion, issues of discrimination, and issues of then of affirmative action, so to speak, for lack of, again, better term. And perhaps the targeting, so to speak, of this African immigrants by the poor is really, in my view, an indication of scapegoating at a national level. That the South African economy, the South African society, the political superstructure has failed to address the salient issues of addressing the legacy of apartheid, as it were. And for political issues, the ANC and indeed the larger political formations have failed to address the salient direct issues of lack of unemployment, the economic collapse, and so also the closure, so to speak. Now, that the poor people in South Africa have targeted what you would call immigrants that are really not really taking their job, so to speak, because they're not, in many, those are business people and what have you, is kind of a political statement that we cannot be ignored and that we need to address the salient issues. Remember, there's this freedom, there is a Malema.
Yeah.
The freedom, the Freedom Party. Yeah. These are really some of the core people who are asking, we cannot be ignored, so to speak. What is the ANC doing? The ANC is really caught up. It doesn't really have a well thought out policy, as it were, to address the radicalization, so to speak, of its core support. That, my view, perhaps would explain that partly.
Partly, yeah.
Yes.
All right. Now, in terms of the limited economic opportunities in, South Africa, I think it's back to the drawing board for the government and ANC party as well. But the backdrop, African countries are reacting in regards to, what is happening in South Africa. When back then the spirit of Ubuntu was just being, inculcated in South Africa, other African countries played a hand in, the end of apartheid and so what. Nigeria, for instance, harboring Nelson Mandela when he was being searched for and wanted to be arrested in the 1960s. I mean, seeing the South African embassy being closed in major towns in Nigeria gives an underlying issue that, this are tough times ahead. Some leaders not attending the World Economic Forum in Cape Town, South Africa, also shows that there is trouble brewing. going forward in terms of unifying Africa, in terms of, the African trade, AFCTA actually, what does this speak in terms of the unity in Africa and actually helping other countries going forward?
Yeah, thank you. I would say this. It's very interesting when you raise the question of Nigeria. Let me put it this way. Nigeria is a fairly difficult and different client. Nigeria plays at a different level and league. A lot of Nigerians would usually say that Africa starts and ends with Nigeria in that regard. And the political class, the political segmentation of Nigeria is quite voluble, so to speak. And Nigeria, therefore, usually uses, its conduct, its foreign policy conduct is to a large extent very frontal, so to speak. So am I surprised that the Nigerian people, the Nigerian government is responding in this manner? No. The bigger question is it perhaps sorting out the issues? Again, right. No. So we must be able to isolate and say that Nigeria operates on a very different level.
All right. Allow me to cut you short. We just want to also highlight something happening in the other part of Africa, specifically Sudan. Yes. And I mean, we laud the efforts to reaching a coalition sort of government with the civil, and the military as well. But right now, an impending issue is hovering around their heads, and this is in regards to being listed as a state sponsoring terrorism country,
yes.
And this might have implications in terms of access to finances from, financial institutions like IMF and the World Bank. They're lobbying for their removal on that list, but it seems United States are taking their time, quote unquote. What is your take on that?
Thank you. I would say that a lot of people are very excited about the changes that have occurred in Sudan, but they are also cautiously optimistic. Mm-hmm. So we have to understand that the Bashir regime has, or rather Bashir is no longer in power, but perhaps his superstructure is still very operational. So with the new government, with the new prime minister, it was a fairly long drawn and intense negotiation. So I would like to imagine that everybody is saying we will be able to move and help Sudan on an incremental basis, because you have to understand that it was basically economic, the issue, but overall it was a political exclusion. Can Sudan therefore be delisted from a terrorism supporting country? You cannot, perhaps as of now, it's still too early, but have the current political structures put in place, will that be able to turn around? People are hoping and praying so. Can then Sudan be delisted? It should be, but I think it's incremental. Yeah. People are waiting to see how far, how soon, how stable. So it's a kind of an incremental game of watch and see. But I think the political message that is coming to Sudan and from regional countries, and indeed the larger international communities, that they welcome these changes. But it's a bit too early.
It's definitely early.
It's a bit too early. That's my thing.
All right, it'll definitely roll out with time. Yeah. Last but not least, very briefly, yes. Pope Francis is in the continent Africa. What prospects might this hold for the 3 African nations that he is visiting? So we could start with Mozambique, because he's already there. What prospects might this hold?
Yeah, for me, I'm very positive about the Pope's visit, and specifically in Mozambique, because you've got to understand that the Catholic Church, and indeed one of the key drivers of the peace process in Mozambique, is a Catholic Church entity. I think it's called St. Egidio or something like to that effect. Yeah. And the Catholic Church has been a very key player in this. So it's, in my view, I think it's a good indication that perhaps the Catholic Church is still very engaged in Africa, and it's a good sign, so to speak.
It's a good sign.
Yes.
All right, many thanks, John Gashie. Due to time, we'll definitely leave it at that, but definitely we'll continue with this conversation, bearing in mind Antonio Guterres was also in the continent and what goodies he might have in store for DR Congo. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
making time.
Welcome.
All right, and that's how we wrap